The massive doors of the Galactic Council chambers slid open with a deep hum. Ambassador Hyunwoo stepped inside, his black diplomatic uniform simple compared to the colorful robes and armor of the alien delegates already seated around the curved table. Behind him walked Captain So Young, her military dress uniform crisp and formal. The chamber was huge. Crystal walls showed the stars outside, and floating lights cast everything in a soft blue glow. Dozens of different alien species sat in specially designed chairs that fit their various body types. Some had scales, others had fur, and a few seemed to be made of living metal. Hyunwoo had studied each species for months. The tall red-skinned Vorthons were known for their aggressive military culture. Their leader, War Marshal Krex, sat with his arms crossed, showing off scars that covered his muscular frame. The pale, thin Etherians valued knowledge above all else. Their representative, Scholar Vexitari, had 4 arms and was taking notes on a floating tablet. The Galactic Council had existed for over 3,000 years. Hundreds of species belonged to it, sharing technology and keeping peace across the galaxy. Earth had been discovered 5 years ago, when human ships finally developed faster-than-light travel. Now humanity was asking to join. The delegation from Earth may present their case, announced the council speaker, a being that looked like a walking tree with glowing bark. Hyunwoo moved to the center of the room. His steps echoed in the silent chamber. He had given speeches before, but never to alien beings who could decide the future of his entire species. "Honored delegates," he began, his voice calm and clear. "Humanity comes before you seeking membership in this great council. We offer our friendship, our knowledge, and our commitment to peace." Several aliens shifted in their seats. The humans looked so ordinary compared to the other species. They had no scales or claws, no psychic powers, no advanced biotechnology visible on their bodies. They seemed almost primitive. War Marshal Krex leaned forward. His voice was deep and rough like grinding stone. "What can your species offer us? You have barely left your home system. Your technology is centuries behind ours. Your military power is—" He paused and looked at Captain So Young with obvious disdain. "Insignificant." Murmurs rippled through the chamber. Other delegates nodded in agreement. It was a fair question. Most species that joined the council brought something special: advanced weapons, unique knowledge, or powerful abilities. Hyunwoo remained calm. He had expected this challenge. "We understand your concerns, War Marshal. Perhaps a demonstration would help." "A demonstration?" Scholar Vextari's 4 eyes blinked in sequence. "What could you possibly demonstrate that we have not seen before?" Captain So Young stepped forward. Her hand moved to a small device on her belt, but she did not draw it. "We would like to show you our military doctrine." The chamber fell silent. Then several aliens began to laugh. The Vorthons were particularly amused. Their entire culture was built around warfare, and they had conquered dozens of star systems. "Your military doctrine?" Krex's laugh was like rocks falling down a mountain. "We have studied your species. You fight with chemical explosives and metal projectiles. Some of our children's toys are more advanced than your weapons." "That is correct," So Young replied without any sign of embarrassment. "Our weapons are simple." "Then what could you possibly teach us about warfare?" demanded a delegate from the Zephyrian Empire, a species known for their energy-based weapons that could crack planets. Hyunwoo and So Young exchanged a look. Something passed between them, a shared understanding that made several of the more perceptive delegates feel suddenly uneasy. "We do not wish to teach you about weapons," Hyunwoo said carefully. "We wish to show you how we choose to use them." The confusion in the chamber was obvious. Most species developed their military doctrine around their capabilities. You fought with whatever gave you the best advantage. The concept of choice in warfare seemed strange. War Marshal Krex stood up. His full height was impressive, nearly 3 meters tall. "Very well, humans. Show us this doctrine, but do not waste our time with primitive strategies. We will need access to your simulation chamber," So Young requested. The council speaker gestured with one of his branch-like arms. "Granted. The chamber can recreate any battlefield scenario." As the delegates began to file out toward the simulation area, conversations buzzed in dozens of different languages. Most were dismissive. The humans seemed desperate to prove themselves worthy. But what could they possibly show that would impress species who had been fighting wars among the stars for millennia? Scholar Vextari walked beside another Etherian delegate. "There is something strange about their confidence. she whispered in their musical language. They are bluffing, her companion replied. Primitive species often overestimate their abilities when first meeting advanced civilizations. But Vextari was not convinced. She had studied hundreds of species, and humans showed unusual patterns. Their body language was wrong for beings who were bluffing. They seemed genuinely calm, even eager to demonstrate their military doctrine. War Marshal Krex was having similar thoughts. His species had conquered many worlds, and he had learned to read the signs of dangerous opponents. The human captain moved like a predator, controlled, aware, ready. But ready for what? The simulation chamber was a vast sphere lined with holographic projectors. It could create perfect recreations of any environment or battle scenario. The delegates took their seats in the observation area, while Hyunwoo and So-young remained in the center. What scenario would you like us to recreate? Asked the technician operating the system. Something simple to start, Hyunwoo replied. A standard military engagement between two equal forces. The chamber shifted and changed. Suddenly, they stood on a rocky battlefield under an alien sky. Two armies faced each other across a valley, one representing human forces, the other a generic alien military. Begin when ready, announced the council speaker. But instead of starting the battle, So-young raised her hand. Before we begin, we need to establish the rules of engagement. Rules? Krex's confusion was obvious. In battle, there are no rules except victory or death. That, said Hyunwoo quietly, is where you are wrong. The chamber fell silent again. But this time the silence felt different. Heavier, more dangerous. Several delegates suddenly realized that they might be about to learn something they were not prepared to understand. Captain So-young's voice carried clearly through the chamber as she began to speak about something the galaxy had never heard of before. The idea that even in war, even when facing death, some things remain sacred. Let us show you, she said, what happens when a species chooses to be civilized. Dr. Minho stepped into the simulation chamber as the holographic battlefield faded away. He was older than the other humans, with gray hair and kind eyes behind simple glasses. In his hands he carried what looked like an ancient book made of real paper. The alien delegates watched with growing curiosity. Most had expected weapons demonstrations or tactical displays. Instead, they were looking at what appeared to be a human scholar. Before we show you how we fight, Minho began, his voice gentle but clear, we must show you how we choose not to fight. He opened the book. The pages were yellow with age and the text was written in multiple human languages. This document is over 400 years old. We call it the Geneva Conventions. Scholar Vextari leaned forward in her seat. What is a convention? An agreement, Minho replied. A promise that all human nations made to each other about how war should be conducted. The chamber buzzed with confused whispers. War was about defeating your enemies by any means necessary. The concept of agreements about warfare seemed impossible to understand. War Marshal Krex's voice cut through the chatter. You made agreements with your enemies? While fighting them? Not with our enemies, Captain So-young corrected. With ourselves. These are rules we follow regardless of what our opponents do. Minho turned a page in the old book. For example, we agree that hospitals and medical personnel cannot be attacked, even during war. The silence that followed was complete. The Vorthans, who had built their entire culture around warfare, looked genuinely shocked. Their wars were total. Everything and everyone was a target if it helped achieve victory. Why would you protect enemy medical facilities? Asked a delegate from the Crystalline Confederacy. Healing their wounded means they can fight you again. Because, Minho said simply, some things are more important than winning. The statement hit the chamber like a physical blow. Several delegates actually recoiled in their seats. The idea that anything could be more important than victory was so alien to their thinking that it seemed impossible. Scholar Vextari's forearms moved rapidly as she took notes. What other restrictions do you place on yourselves? Minho smiled sadly and turned more pages. We cannot attack civilians. We cannot torture prisoners. We cannot use certain weapons that cause unnecessary suffering. We must care for enemy wounded. We must allow religious practices even among our prisoners. Each rule he read caused more confusion among the delegates. These were not the words of a weak species trying to limit damage. These were the self-imposed restrictions of beings who had apparently decided that some methods of warfare were simply wrong. A delegate from the Hive Collective, a species that fought as a single mind, spoke up. "This makes no sense. You handicap yourselves while your enemies can use any method they choose?" "Exactly," So Young confirmed. "But why?" The question came from multiple delegates at once. Dr. Minho closed the book and looked around the chamber. His expression was serious now. "Because we learned something important during our wars. We learned that how you fight changes who you are." He gestured to the holographic projectors. "May I show you something?" The chamber shifted again. Now they stood in what looked like an ancient human city, but it was burning. Bodies lay in the streets. The smoke and smell seemed real enough to make several delegates uncomfortable. "This is from one of our wars before we created the Geneva Conventions," Minho explained. "We fought without rules. We did whatever it took to win." The scene changed, showing mass graves, destroyed hospitals, and civilians fleeing in terror. "We won this war," Minho continued. "But afterward, we looked at what we had become. We looked at what we had done to achieve victory, and we decided that some victories cost too much." War Marshal Kreck stood up abruptly. "You speak of costs, but war has always had costs. That is the nature of conflict." "Yes," So Young agreed. "But we learned to choose which costs we were willing to pay." The holographic scene changed again. Now it showed a more recent human conflict, but this one looked completely different. Soldiers helped wounded enemies. Medical stations flew special flags that both sides respected. Prisoners were treated with dignity. "This is how we fight now," Minho said. "With rules. With limits. With honor." "And do you win these wars?" asked an Etherian delegate. "Sometimes," So Young replied. "But we always remain human." The distinction was lost on most of the delegates, but Scholar Vexitari was beginning to understand something troubling. "You fight harder battles in order to preserve your humanity? We fight the right battles in the right way," Minho corrected. Admiral Jehoon stepped forward for the first time. He was tall and thin, with scars on his hands that spoke of military service. His voice was quiet, but it carried clearly through the chamber. "The Geneva Conventions are not restrictions," he said. "They are the minimum standards we maintain when we are being civilized." The temperature in the chamber seemed to drop. Several delegates suddenly realized that there was something very wrong with what they were hearing. "Minimum standards?" Vextari's voice was barely above a whisper. "What happens," asked a nervous Zephyrian delegate, "when you are not being civilized?" The humans exchanged looks again. That same understanding passed between them, and this time even more delegates noticed it. There was something underneath their calm words, something they were not saying. "We hope," Admiral Jehoon said carefully, "that we never have to show you." War Marshal Krex had been silent for several minutes, but now he spoke with a different tone. The mockery was gone from his voice. "How many of these conventions do you have?" Dr. Minho opened the book again. "The Geneva Conventions have 149 articles, but they are just one part of our laws of war. There are also the Hague Conventions, the Rome Statute, and dozens of other agreements. Hundreds of rules," breathed an alien delegate. "For civilized warfare," Minho confirmed. The chamber was quiet except for the sound of Scholar Vextari's rapid note-taking. Finally, War Marshal Krex asked the question that was on everyone's mind. "And what happens if someone breaks these rules?" Captain So Young's expression did not change, but something shifted in her posture. "Then we stop being civilized." The words hung in the air like a threat that no one quite understood yet. But they could all feel it. The sense that they had just learned something important and terrifying about the species standing before them. "Perhaps," Admiral Jehoon said softly, "we should show you our escalation protocols." General Unji walked to the center of the simulation chamber with the measured steps of someone who had spent decades in military service. She was shorter than the other humans, but there was something about her presence that made even War Marshal Krex pay attention. "Our species," she began, "has learned to organize conflict into levels. Each level has its own rules, its own purposes, and its own acceptable methods." She gestured to the holographic displays around them. Numbers appeared in the air. A simple list from 1 to 15. Level 1 is police action. Minimum force, maximum protection for all persons involved. Level 2 is peacekeeping operations. Level 3 is limited military intervention. As she spoke, each level lit up with examples. The delegates saw human forces carefully arresting criminals, protecting civilians, and using only enough force to complete their missions. Scholar Vextari was taking notes rapidly with all four arms. These seem reasonable, similar to our own peacekeeping methods. Level 4, General Unji continued, is regional conflict. Level 5 is extended warfare. Level 6 is total regional engagement. The examples changed. Now they showed larger battles, but the humans still followed strict rules. Medical facilities remained protected. Prisoners were treated well. Civilian areas were avoided when possible. Level 7 is planetary warfare with full military mobilization. The Vorthan delegates nodded. This was more like what they expected from military doctrine. Large-scale battles with entire planets involved. Each level, General Unji explained, removes certain restrictions while maintaining others. Level 7, for example, allows us to target military infrastructure on a planetary scale, but we still protect hospitals, schools, and religious sites. A delegate from the Machine Collective spoke up. This seems unnecessarily complex. Why not simply use maximum force from the beginning? Colonel Dong-hyun stepped forward. He was younger than the general, with serious eyes and several small scars on his face, because sometimes the cure is worse than the disease. Let me show you. The simulation changed to show historical footage from Earth. This was called the Korean conflict. We fought at level 4 for 3 years. The delegates watched human soldiers fighting in difficult terrain, always following rules of engagement even when it made their job harder. Casualties, approximately 2.5 million total, including all sides. Duration, 3 years. Result, limited success, region stabilized. The scene changed. This is a simulation of the same conflict fought at level 8. Now the warfare looked completely different. The rules were different. The targets were different. The methods were different. Casualties in this scenario, approximately 15 million total. Duration 6 months. Result, complete victory, region destroyed. The contrast was stark. The aliens could see that humans were capable of far more destructive warfare than they had initially demonstrated. But they chose not to use it. Level 8, General Unji said quietly, removes protection for enemy civilian infrastructure. Level 9 removes protection for enemy civilian populations in military zones. Several delegates shifted uncomfortably in their seats. They were beginning to understand that they were not looking at a weak species with limited options. They were looking at a species that deliberately chose to fight with handicaps. War Marshal Krex leaned forward. How many levels did you reach in your worst wars? Colonel Dong-hyun's expression darkened. World War II reached level 8 in some theaters. It lasted 6 years and killed over 60 million humans. The numbers hit the chamber like a physical blow. For a species that had barely reached the stars, these casualty figures were enormous. Vietnam reached level 5. Dong-hyun continued. Duration, nearly 20 years. We learned that some enemies cannot be defeated with limited engagement. And level 9. Asked Scholar Vextari, though her voice suggested she was not sure she wanted to know. We have never fought at level 9, General Unji replied. We came close twice but stepped back each time. Why? The question came from multiple delegates. Because, Unji said simply, level 9 is where we start to become something we do not want to be. She gestured again, and the numbers in the air began to glow more brightly. Levels 10, 11, and 12 pulsed with red light. Level 10 eliminates all protection for enemy civilians. Level 11 permits chemical and biological warfare. Level 12 allows systematic destruction of enemy culture and infrastructure. The chamber was deadly quiet now. Even the Vorthans, who prided themselves on their warrior culture, looked disturbed. Have you ever? Began a crystalline delegate. No, Unji cut him off. Levels 10 and above exist only in theory. They are plans we hope never to use. But you have made these plans, War Marshal Krex observed. His voice had lost all trace of mockery. Colonel Dong-hyun nodded grimly. Every human military academy studies these scenarios. We train for them. We prepare for them. Because if the time ever comes when we need level 10 or above, we cannot afford to hesitate. What about levels 13, 14, and 15? The question came from a small delegate in the back of the chamber, barely audible. General Unji was quiet for a long moment. When she spoke, her voice was different, harder, colder. Level 13 is systematic extinction of enemy species. Level 14 is total war with complete mobilization of human civilization. Level 15 is... She paused, looking around the chamber at all the alien faces watching her. Level 15 is when we stop caring about our own survival, when we accept that both we and our enemies will die, but we make sure we die second. The silence that followed was complete. Several delegates were visibly shaken. The machine collective representatives' lights were flashing in what appeared to be distress patterns. Scholar Vexitari's 4 arms had stopped taking notes. You have planned for your own extinction? We have planned for every possibility, Yunji confirmed, including the possibility that an enemy might force us to choose between surrender and mutual destruction. And which would you choose? Asked War Marshal Krex, though his voice suggested he already knew the answer. We would die fighting, Colonel Dong-hyun said without hesitation. But we would not die alone. The implications were staggering. The delegates were looking at a species that had not only planned for every level of warfare, up to and including their own extinction, but had done so with the same careful organization they applied to everything else. This is madness, whispered an Etherian delegate. This is preparation, General Yunji corrected. We prepare for the worst so that we can always choose something better. But surely, said a Zephyrian delegate desperately, surely you would never actually use these higher levels. General Yunji looked at him with something that might have been pity. We used nuclear weapons on our own species, rather than accept defeat in a war we considered necessary. What do you think we would do to aliens who threatened our existence? The question hung in the air like a challenge, and for the first time since the humans had arrived, not a single alien delegate had an answer. Perhaps, General Yunji said softly, we should show you what these levels look like when we actually use them. Commander Yu-jin stepped into the center of the simulation chamber as the numbered list faded from view. She was young for a human military commander, but her eyes held the weight of someone who had seen real combat. 5 years ago, she began, we encountered a situation in the Kepler 442 system. The Razak Empire had enslaved 3 different species there. The holographic display shifted to show a star system with several planets. The delegates could see the orbital stations and the massive Razak warships patrolling between worlds. The Galactic Council knew about this situation. Yujin continued, glancing around the chamber. You condemned the Razak actions in 17 different resolutions. You sent 12 diplomatic protests. You held emergency sessions. Scholar Vextari looked uncomfortable. The situation was complex. The Razak were council members. We had to follow proper procedures. You did nothing, Yujin said simply. So we did something. The simulation changed to show a human fleet approaching the system. The ships were smaller than the Razak vessels, and there were fewer of them. We sent Admiral Park's fleet with orders to resolve the situation at Level 3 engagement, Yujin explained. War Marshal Krex studied the display. Level 3. Limited military intervention with full protection protocols. Exactly. We fought with one hand tied behind our backs because we chose to. The battle began to play out in the simulation. The human ships moved with precision, but they were clearly handicapping themselves. When Razak vessels were disabled, human boarding parties captured them instead of destroying them. When Razak fighters ejected from damaged craft, human ships stopped fighting to rescue them. This is inefficient, observed a machine collective delegate. You could have won much faster with different tactics. Yes, agreed Captain Taemin as he joined Yujin in the center. But winning fast was not our only goal. The simulation showed human ground forces taking over the slave facilities. But instead of simply attacking, they were careful to protect the enslaved populations. Medical teams treated wounded Razak soldiers alongside their victims. Our casualties were significantly higher because we followed Level 3 protocols, Yujin admitted. We lost ships and soldiers protecting people who had been trying to kill us minutes before. Why? The question came from a confused Vorthan delegate. Because that is what Level 3 means, Taemin replied. Maximum protection for all persons, including enemies. The simulation showed the aftermath of the battle. Razak prisoners were held in comfortable facilities. Their wounded received the same medical care as human soldiers. The enslaved species were freed and given aid to rebuild their societies. The Razak surrendered after 6 months of fighting, Yujin concluded. They released all slaves, paid reparations, and requested to join our diplomatic rehabilitation program. Scholar Vexitari looked up from her notes. Rehabilitation program? We help former enemies rebuild their societies along more peaceful lines, Taman explained. The Razak are now productive council members who contribute to peacekeeping efforts. The chamber buzzed with whispered conversations. This was not how most species fought wars. The idea of rehabilitating enemies instead of destroying them was almost as strange as fighting with self-imposed restrictions. War Marshal Krex leaned forward. And if they had not surrendered? The expression on both human commanders' faces changed. Something darker appeared in their eyes. Show them, Commander Yujin said to the simulation technician. The display reset to the beginning of the same scenario, but now different numbers appeared. Level 9 engagement. Same situation, Taman said. Same enemy. Different rules. The new battle was completely different. Human ships did not waste time capturing disabled vessels. They destroyed them outright. Boarding parties moved through Razak stations like a deadly wind, eliminating resistance with brutal efficiency. Level 9 removes civilian protection in military zones, Eugene explained as the simulation showed human forces systematically dismantling Razak infrastructure. Enemy civilian facilities near military targets become acceptable casualties. The delegates watched in growing horror as the human fleet methodically destroyed not just military targets, but the economic and social infrastructure that supported them. Factories, communication networks, transportation hubs, all were eliminated with surgical precision. No medical aid for enemy wounded, Taman added, as the display showed human forces leaving disabled Razak soldiers behind. No protection for enemy civilians who might support military efforts. No rehabilitation programs. The simulated war was over in 3 weeks instead of 6 months, but the cost was visible in the burning planets and the massive casualty figures scrolling across the display. Total Razak casualties in this scenario, Eugene read from the display, 2 and 3 billion over 18 months of systematic destruction. Complete collapse of Razak civilization, no surrender, extinction. The chamber was absolutely silent. The contrast between the two approaches was staggering. The same human fleet, the same enemy, but the outcomes were completely different worlds. But you still followed rules, whispered an Etherian delegate. Even at level 9 you had protocols. Of course, Taman confirmed. Level 9 has very specific guidelines about acceptable targets, rules of engagement, and strategic objectives. We would still be following our doctrine. Just not the nice parts of it, Eugene added. A crystalline delegate spoke up. The level 3 engagement was clearly more difficult for you. Why did you choose it? Because we could, Taman said simply. We were strong enough to win while still being moral. So we chose to be moral. And if you had not been strong enough? Asked War Marshal Krex. The two human commanders exchanged a look. Then we would have chosen level 4, or level 5, or whatever level we needed to win. Even level 9. Pressed the Vorthon leader. Even level 9, Eugene confirmed. If the alternative was losing to slavers who tortured entire species for profit, then yes. We would have burned their civilization to ash and called it justice. Scholar Vextari's note-taking had become frantic. But the casualties, the destruction, would have been acceptable to achieve our objectives, Taman said coldly. That is what level 9 means. We accept those costs to achieve victory. A small delegate from a peaceful species in the back row asked a question that everyone was thinking. What if the enemy had been stronger? What if level 9 had not been enough? Commander Yujin looked directly at the small alien. Her voice was steady and certain. Then we would have gone to level 10, and if that was not enough, level 11, and so on until either we won or there was nothing left to fight for. You would destroy yourselves rather than lose? Asked War Marshal Krex. We would destroy everything rather than lose, Eugene corrected. The question is not whether we would pay the price for victory. The question is whether our enemies are prepared to pay the price for fighting us. The implications settled over the chamber like a dark cloud. The delegates were beginning to understand that they were not dealing with a typical species. These humans did not fight wars, they solved problems. And if the problem required the extinction of their enemies, they had already planned for that possibility. There is something else you should understand, Captain Taman said into the silence. The Razak situation was resolved 5 years ago. They are now our allies. They contribute ships to our joint peacekeeping forces. You turned enemies into friends, observed Scholar Vextari. We gave them that choice, Eugene corrected. Level 3 engagement allows for rehabilitation and cooperation. Level 9 does not. Which would you prefer to fight against? Taman asked the assembled delegates. Humans following Level 3 protocols or humans following Level 9 protocols? No one answered, but the question hung in the air like a threat and a promise combined. The humans were offering the galaxy a choice, but only as long as the galaxy was smart enough to make the right one. The simulation chamber transformed into something that looked like a pristine white room, filled with glowing displays and mathematical equations. Admiral Sungmin walked slowly to the center, his movements deliberate and careful. Behind him came Dr. He-jin, a woman whose calm expression somehow made the delegates more nervous than any weapon could have. "You have asked about our doctrine," Admiral Sungmin said quietly. "What you have seen so far is how we fight when we are trying to be good neighbors." The chamber fell silent except for the soft humming of the holographic displays. The mathematical models floating in the air showed complex calculations and probability matrices that hurt to look at directly. Dr. Hai-jin stepped forward. "I am a military ethicist. My job is to determine when certain moral constraints can be removed for the greater good." She gestured to the equations around them. Every level of our doctrine removes specific ethical limitations while maintaining others. We have spent centuries calculating exactly what happens when civilized beings choose to become uncivilized. Scholar Vextari had stopped taking notes entirely. Her forearms were trembling slightly. "What do you mean by removing moral constraints?" "Level 10, Dr. Hyojin said simply, and one of the displays lit up with horrifying clarity. Eliminates all restrictions regarding enemy civilian populations. They become legitimate targets for any purpose that serves our strategic goals." The words hit the chamber like a physical blow. Several delegates actually moved back in their seats. "Level 11 removes restrictions on biological and chemical warfare," she continued. "Level 12 permits systematic destruction of enemy culture, religion, and historical heritage." Admiral Sung-min watched the faces of the alien delegates as they processed this information. "You see, we have learned something that most species never discover. The difference between choosing not to do something and being unable to do it." War Marshal Krex found his voice first. "You are saying you can commit these atrocities but you choose not to?" "We are saying we have planned for them," Sung-min corrected. "We have weapons designed specifically for Level 11 engagement. We have strategies developed for Level 12 cultural elimination. We have logistics systems ready to support Level 13 operations." "And Level 13? The question came from a terrified Etherian delegate. Dr. Hyjin's expression never changed. "Level 13 is systematic extinction. Not just military defeat, not just occupation, but the complete removal of an enemy species from existence." The silence that followed was complete. Even the background humming of the station seemed to quiet in response to her words. "How?" whispered Scholar Vextari. "Multiple methods," Hyjin replied matter-of-factly. "Biological agents designed to target specific genetic markers. Nanotechnology that can rewrite DNA at the cellular level. Antimatter weapons that can crack planets. Stellar engineering that can make suns go nova." Each method she listed caused visible distress among the delegates. These were not theoretical concepts, these were actual plans with actual capabilities behind them. "But surely," said a desperate crystalline delegate, "these are just theoretical studies. Academic exercises." General Namjoon stepped into view for the first time. He was older than the other humans, with gray hair and scars that spoke of a lifetime in military service. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of absolute certainty. "Every weapon system I just heard described exists in our arsenal. Every strategy has been tested in simulation. Every logistical requirement has been calculated and prepared." The chamber erupted in shocked whispers and alarmed discussions in dozens of alien languages. "We nearly triggered Level 13 twice in our own history," Namjoon continued, speaking over the noise. "Once during what we called the Cold War, when two human nations aimed extinction-level weapons at each other for 40 years. Once during the climate wars, when resource depletion nearly led to global biological warfare." "What stopped you?" asked War Marshal Krex. "We stopped ourselves," Namjoon replied. "Because we realized that some victories are not worth winning." Dr. Hyjin gestured to another display. "Level 14 is total war, the complete mobilization of human civilization for the extinction of our enemies. Every human becomes a soldier. Every resource becomes a weapon. Every thought becomes focused on victory regardless of cost. The display showed terrifying projections. Entire solar systems converted into weapons factories. Planetary populations transformed into military forces. Space itself weaponized with devices that could destroy fleets from light years away. Our economists estimate that we could maintain level 14 operations for approximately 50 years before our civilization collapsed from the effort, Hyejin noted clinically. But we would almost certainly achieve our objectives within that time frame. And level 15? The question came from multiple delegates simultaneously. General Namjoon's expression became something that frightened even the warlike Vorthans. Level 15 is when we stop caring about our own survival. When we accept that both we and our enemies will cease to exist. But we make sure we die second. He gestured to the final display, and the mathematics that appeared were so complex and terrifying that several delegates closed their eyes rather than look at them. Level 15 weapons are designed not just to kill enemies, but to make entire regions of space uninhabitable for millions of years. We would salt the Earth so thoroughly that nothing could ever grow there again. Stellar compression bombs that can chain react through multiple star systems, Dr. Hyejin added in the same calm tone she had used throughout. Self-replicating nanomachines that convert matter into more weapons. Quantum viruses that can spread through faster-than-light communication networks. You would destroy yourselves to destroy your enemies? Asked Scholar Vextari, her voice barely audible. We would destroy everything, Namjoon confirmed. Better an empty universe than one where evil triumphs. Admiral Sungmin looked around the chamber at the terrified faces of the alien delegates. These capabilities exist because we learned an important lesson during our planetary wars. Sometimes the only way to ensure that evil does not win is to be prepared to make sure that nothing wins. The chamber was deadly quiet except for the sound of several delegates' labored breathing. The scope of what they had just learned was beyond their ability to fully process. But, said a small voice from the back. But you choose not to use these weapons? Every day, Admiral Sungmin confirmed. Every hour. Every moment. We choose to be civilized instead of simply being unstoppable. Dr. Hyejin turned to face the delegates directly. The question you should be asking yourselves is this. What would it take to make us stop choosing civilization? War Marshal Krex, the most warlike being in the chamber, was visibly shaken. What would it take? General Namjoon's answer was simple and final. Threaten our existence or the existence of innocents we have sworn to protect and find out. The words hung in the air like a promise and a warning. The delegates were looking at a species that had weaponized morality itself. They fought with handicaps not because they were weak, but because they were so terrifyingly strong that they had to limit themselves to remain recognizable as the beings they wanted to be. Now you understand, Admiral Sungmin said softly, why we hope you will choose to be our friends.